They didn't just take a piece of my land. They built a whole new reality on top of it and expected me to accept it. 6 feet. That's all it was on paper. 6 feet of grass. A stretch of backyard most people wouldn't think twice about. But the longer this went on, the more I realized it was never about the land. It was about what happens when someone decides your boundaries don't matter. I live in a small neighborhood outside of town called Millhaven, the kind of place where people wave from their driveways but rarely know much about each other. Everybody keeps their lawns trimmed, their mailboxes painted, and their business mostly private. That's how I liked it. 5 years ago, I bought a simple 3-bedroom house at the end of a cul-de-sac. Nothing fancy. The roof wasn't new. The kitchen wasn't magazine-worthy, and the backyard sloped just enough to make mowing mildly annoying. But it was mine. Every mortgage payment, every weekend project, every sweat-soaked summer afternoon, fixing something that broke reminded me of that. The best part was the backyard. My 2 dogs, Cooper and Hank, treated it like their personal kingdom. I'd fire up the grill on weekends, invite a couple buddies over, crack open a cheap beer, and watch the sun disappear behind the tree line. It wasn't luxury, but honestly, I never wanted luxury. Then the house behind mine sold. For months it had sat empty. Weeds, peeling paint, broken shutters. One of those properties everyone assumed would keep getting worse until someone finally tore it down. Instead, contractors showed up. Then more contractors. Then dumpsters. Then landscapers. Within 2 months, the place looked completely different. New siding, new windows, fresh stonework. And eventually, the new owners arrived. Their names were Preston and Lauren Whitaker. Now, I want to be fair here. Neither one of them was openly rude. At least not at first. Preston was one of those guys who somehow looked like he was headed to a country club, even when he was taking out the trash. Perfect polo shirts. Expensive watch. Always carrying some kind of drink. Lauren had this polished smile that seemed permanently attached to her face. The kind of smile that looked friendly until you realized it never changed no matter what was happening. They introduced themselves the first week. We exchanged numbers. Had the usual neighbor conversation. Everything seemed normal. At least until one Saturday morning. I walked outside with a cup of coffee and noticed 3 wooden stakes sticking out of the ground near the back of my yard. At first I figured somebody made a mistake. Then I looked closer. The stakes weren't near the property line. They were past it. About 6 feet past it. Into my yard. I stood there staring at them longer than I probably should have. You know how people always talk about property lines like they're abstract things on paper? They're not. When you've lived somewhere long enough, you know exactly where your space begins and ends. Not because you memorize measurements, but because you live in it. You mow it. You maintain it. You build memories in it. I walked over, grabbed the first stake, pulled it out, then did the same with the other 2. Problem solved. Or so I thought. That evening there was a knock at my front door. I opened it and found Preston standing there holding a bottle of red wine. For a second, I honestly thought he was coming over to apologize. Instead, he smiled and said, "Hey, neighbor, thought we should clear something up." That sentence alone told me exactly why he was there. I stayed in the doorway. Didn't invite him inside. Didn't offer him a drink. Just listened. "We're expanding our patio," he said, "and there seems to be some confusion about the property line." I almost laughed. Confusion? He nodded. "Yeah, we had someone take a look. That section behind your yard lines up a lot better with our design." I stared at him. He said it so casually, like he was discussing landscaping, like he was talking about moving a flower bed, not taking part of someone else's property. I pointed toward the backyard. "That section is my yard." His smile tightened slightly. Property lines aren't always as straightforward as people think. Now, maybe some people would have backed down right there. Maybe some people would have started second-guessing themselves. I wasn't one of them. I know exactly where my property line is. For the first time, his expression changed. Just a little. Enough to see what was underneath the politeness. "Well," he said, adjusting his grip on the wine bottle, "we'll look into it." Then he turned around and walked away. I watched him leave, close the door, and figured that would be the end of it. It wasn't. Because 2 weeks later, I left town for 4 days to visit my older brother in Ohio. And while I was gone, my neighbors made a decision that would turn a simple boundary dispute into a full-blown war. When I pulled back into my driveway 4 days later, everything felt normal. The house looked the same. The mailbox was still leaning slightly to the left. Cooper and Hank were losing their minds in the back seat because they knew we were home. Nothing seemed different, at least not until I stepped into the backyard. I still remember stopping mid-stride. For a second, my brain couldn't process what I was looking at. The open patch of grass behind my house was gone. In its place sat a massive stone patio. Not a small one. Not something somebody threw together over a weekend. This thing looked like it belonged behind a luxury home magazine cover. There were polished pavers, built-in seating, decorative lighting, stainless steel appliances, planters, and enough space to host 20 people comfortably. And about a third of it sat directly on my property. I actually looked around to make sure I wasn't losing my mind. Maybe I was standing in the wrong place. Maybe something wasn't lining up. But everything else matched. The trees, the fence corners, the slope of the ground. The patio was the only thing that had changed. And somebody had built it 6 feet into my yard. I felt anger rising, but underneath there was something worse. Disbelief. Because this wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. This wasn't a contractor guessing wrong. This was deliberate. Somebody had made a conscious decision to wait until I left town and then build anyway. That realization hit harder than the construction itself. I went inside and pulled out the folder containing every document from my home purchase. The survey was exactly where I'd left it. I spread it across the kitchen table and traced the property line with my finger. Straight, clear, undeniable. The patio crossed it. No question. No gray area. No debate. I folded the survey, walked outside, and headed directly toward the Whitaker's house. Lauren answered the sliding door. She was holding a glass of rose and looked mildly surprised to see me. Then that polished smile appeared. Oh, hey. I didn't bother with small talk. Your patio is on my property. Her smile barely moved. I don't think that's correct. I have this survey. We had measurements done. Then your measurements are wrong. She took a sip of her drink. Completely calm. Completely unbothered. Maybe your survey is outdated. That sentence nearly made me laugh from pure frustration. Outdated. As if property ownership worked like software updates. Get Preston. A few moments later he appeared. He didn't look surprised. That was the first thing I noticed. He looked annoyed. Not shocked. Not confused. Annoyed. Like I was interrupting his evening. I showed him the survey. He barely glanced at it. We built according to the information we had. You built on my land. We invested a lot into that patio. I don't care. His jaw tightened. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he gave a small shrug. The kind people give when they've already decided they're right. If you truly believe that, he said, you should hire a lawyer. The way he said it made my stomach turn. Not because it was threatening, because it was dismissive. Like he already knew I couldn't stop him. Like the money he'd spent somehow made reality negotiable. I looked at both of them standing there on a structure that partially belonged to me. Then I folded the survey. Fine. That was all I said. Fine. I walked away before I said something I'd regret. The next morning, I called an attorney. Her name was Rebecca Sloan. No nonsense. No wasted words. The kind of lawyer who spoke in complete sentences and expected everyone else to do the same. I emailed her every document I had. The survey, photos, property records, everything. The following afternoon she called. You're correct. Just like that. No hesitation. No uncertainty. They're over the line. I leaned back in my chair. Part of me felt relieved. The other part felt exhausted. So what happens now? We file. How long? There was a pause. Long enough for me to know I wasn't going to like the answer. Months. Possibly longer. I rubbed my forehead. And during that time, they'll probably continue using the patio. That turned out to be exactly what happened. Every Friday, evening cars started lining the street. Every Saturday, music floated over the fence. Every Sunday afternoon ended with laughter coming from the patio, sitting partially on my property. I tried ignoring it. For a while. I really did. I told myself the legal process would handle everything. I told myself patience mattered. Then one afternoon, patience ran out. I was cleaning up after the dogs when I heard Lauren talking to a group of friends. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't trying to provoke me. In some ways that made it worse. Because she sounded completely sincere. The yard feels so much bigger now, she said. Everybody laughed. She smiled. It flows better this way. Flows better. That phrase stayed with me all day. Maybe because it perfectly captured how they viewed the situation. They didn't think they'd taken anything. They thought they'd improved it. That evening, I sat on my back porch with a beer and watched the sun go down. Cooper lay beside my chair. Hank snored near the steps. And I kept staring at that patio. Then something clicked. Not anger. Not revenge. Just clarity. I was waiting for somebody else to solve a problem happening in my backyard. Why? The next morning, I called a fencing company. A guy named Walter came out 2 days later. Mid-50s. Sunburned neck. Permanent skin. Looked like he'd spent his entire life outdoors. I showed him the survey. Then I showed him the patio. He stared at it for several seconds. Finally, he let out a whistle. Well, that was all he said at first. Then he laughed. They really committed to the idea, didn't they? Yeah. You want the fence exactly on the line? No compromise. He nodded slowly. Noble fair. Nope. You sure? I looked at the patio. Then I looked back at him. Exactly on the line. He smiled. The kind of smile a man gets when he knows a story is about to become interesting. We can start Saturday. Saturday arrived. Right on schedule. 3 trucks rolled into my driveway shortly after 8 in the morning. Workers unloaded equipment. Posts. Concrete. Tools. The whole setup. I watched them begin marking the property line. And 20 minutes later, the back door of the Whitaker's house slid open. Preston stepped outside. At first, he looked confused, then concerned, then alarmed, because he finally understood where the fence was going. Straight through the middle of his patio. He walked toward me quickly. What are they doing? Building a fence. Where? I pointed. His eyes followed the line. The color drained from his face. You can't do that. I almost smiled. Why not? Because it'll split the patio. Yeah. His mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, like his brain was struggling to process the situation. Lauren came outside seconds later. She looked at the survey stakes, then the workers, then the patio, then me. What is this? The property line. You can't just build through a structure. Our structure. I couldn't help it. I laughed, for the first time in weeks. A genuine laugh. That's funny. Preston's face darkened. I'm serious. So am I. The first post went into the ground. Then another. Then another. The sound echoed across both yards. Every thump felt like a countdown. And, judging by the look on Preston's face, he was finally beginning to realize that this fight wasn't going the way he'd imagined. The first post went into the ground. Then another. Then another. The sound echoed across both yards, and with every thud of the auger, Preston looked a little less confident. Lauren had already pulled out her phone. I'm calling the police, she announced. Walter didn't even stop working. Neither did his crew. I shrugged. Go ahead. About 20 minutes later, a patrol car rolled up to the curb. The officer who stepped out looked exactly like a man who had responded to far too many neighbor disputes in his career. He took one look at the patio, one look at the fence posts, and let out a slow breath before walking over. Morning, folks. Nobody answered right away. The officer turned to me first. What's going on? I handed him a survey. Installing a fence on my property. He studied the documents carefully. Then he walked the line himself, comparing landmarks, measurements, and markers. Preston followed him the entire time like a nervous investor watching the stock market crash in real time. Finally, the officer stopped. He looked at Preston, then at the patio, then back at the survey. Sir, he said calmly, according to these records, part of your patio appears to be on his property. That's disputed. Preston shot back immediately. Maybe. The officer handed the survey back to me. But until a court says otherwise, he's allowed to build a fence on his property. The silence that followed was beautiful. Not because anyone won. Not yet. But because for the first time since this started, reality had entered the conversation. The officer left. The work continued. And by sunset, an 8-foot privacy fence stood exactly where the property line had always been. Straight. Solid. Unapologetic. From my side, it looked perfectly normal. From their side, it cut directly through the middle of what had once been their showcase patio. For the first time in weeks, I slept well. But here's something people don't talk about when it comes to disputes like this. Winning a small battle doesn't end the war. Sometimes it just changes the battlefield. Over the next few weeks, things became strangely quiet. No more large parties. No more late-night gatherings. No more laughter drifting across the yard. The fence had changed everything. But I wasn't interested in giving them opportunities to create new problems. So I installed a locking gate. Added a bright, no trespassing sign. Then, purely because I'd wanted them for years anyway, I finally got chickens. 3 of them. Millie, June, and an absolutely unhinged little bird named Betty. Betty seemed to believe every sunrise was a national emergency. Every morning, she announced it to the entire county. Now, before anyone starts feeling sorry for my neighbors, I checked every local ordinance before bringing those birds home. Everything was completely legal. I wasn't breaking rules. I was simply enjoying my property. Funny how that concept suddenly mattered. A month later, things escalated again. I got served legal papers. Preston was suing me. Harassment, property damage, emotional distress, interference with enjoyment of property. The whole package. When Rebecca called to tell me, she actually laughed. Not a loud laugh. Just the kind people make when they know a bad argument is about to collapse under its own weight. We expected this, she said. So what now? Now we respond. And we did. We filed our own claims. Property encroachment, trespassing, restoration costs, legal expenses. Everything supported by documentation. Everything supported by facts. A few months later, we found ourselves sitting inside a courtroom. Nothing dramatic. No television-style speeches. No surprise witnesses bursting through doors. Just paperwork, evidence, and two very different versions of the same story. Preston went first. I'll give him credit. He spoke well, confident, professional, reasonable. He painted himself as a homeowner who had relied on information provided during a renovation project and was now being unfairly punished by an unreasonable neighbor. For a few minutes, it almost sounded convincing. Then Rebecca stood up, and piece by piece, she took the entire thing apart. She presented the certified county survey, property records, construction timelines, photographs, emails, everything. Then she asked a simple question. Can the defendant provide the professional survey he relied upon before construction began? The room got very quiet. Preston looked toward his attorney. His attorney shuffled through a folder. More silence. Finally, they produced what they had. And honestly, it wasn't much. Because the survey Preston had referenced for months wasn't a certified survey. It wasn't filed with the county. It wasn't signed by a licensed surveyor. It wasn't even an official survey. It was a rough site estimate created by a contractor. An educated guess. The judge looked down at the document, then looked up, then looked directly at Preston. That expression on the judge's face is something I'll never forget. Not anger, not outrage, disappointment. Like a teacher discovering a student had copied the wrong answers and somehow expected extra credit. You constructed a permanent structure based on an unofficial estimate, the judge asked. Preston tried explaining, tried reframing, tried softening the language. None of it helped. The judge raised a hand, and that was pretty much the end of it. You assumed ownership of land that had not been legally verified as yours. The courtroom went silent. That was a choice. 3 words. That's all it took. That was a choice. The ruling came shortly afterward. The court ordered every portion of the patio crossing onto my property to be removed. The land had to be restored. My legal fees had to be paid, and all claims against me were dismissed. Just like that. Months of stress ended in a matter of minutes. A week later, I stood in my backyard with a cup of coffee watching demolition crews arrive. There was something strangely poetic about it. The same type of trucks that had built the patio were now there to destroy it. Jackhammers started breaking stone. Workers loaded debris into trailers. Sections of expensive masonry disappeared piece by piece. What once looked permanent suddenly looked temporary. By the end of the day, most of it was gone. I didn't cheer. I didn't celebrate. I didn't even talk to Preston. I just stood there watching. Because the truth is, victory didn't feel the way I thought it would. I wasn't happy they lost money. I wasn't happy they had to tear everything apart. What mattered was something much simpler. The line was back where it belonged. Clear, recognized, respected. After that, things settled down. We became strangers again. The best kind of neighbors, honestly. No arguments. No parties. No legal letters. Just distance. The fence stayed. The chicken stayed too. Especially Betty. She still treats every sunrise like breaking news. And every now and then I'll sit on my back porch with a cup of coffee, watching my dogs wander across the yard, listening to those ridiculous chickens, and I'll think about how strange it is that 6 feet of land taught me more about people than years of ordinary conversation ever could. Because sometimes disputes aren't really about property. They're about entitlement, respect, boundaries, and what happens when someone decides those boundaries only apply to other people. Now I'm curious what you think. If you were in my position, would you have fought all the way to the end? Would you have compromised and try to keep the peace? Or would you have done exactly what I did and forced the issue all the way to court? Drop your thoughts in the comments below because I've heard strong arguments from both sides, and honestly, years later, people still can't seem to agree on where the real line was drawn.